Despite the AI frenzy out there where every single company is putting, a new 52-week high, or in case of Nvidia and a lot of others, the all-time highs by quite a distance, AMD is down over the past month, and especially compared to, March highs, which was their all-time high at above 220 US dollar. We are now, back to 145, 155 level. And this, in my opinion, offers the best investment opportunity in the semiconductor AI space for 2024. This is my opinion and not investment advice, but stick around to the end of the video to figure out why. So it has to do a lot with the data center segment for AMD and how I think this company is a missed opportunity right now and with huge potential. And I'll explain it through this Excel sheet. So you can see that these are my, expected revenues. So Q1 of 2024 is the ones that reported recently. This cell to the left, Q2 of 2024, is my expectations. So if you can see here, I'm expecting that the data center revenue will go up compared to previous quarter quite a bit, from 2.3 billion to around 2.7, 2.8 billion. And that's a high margin business, it's gonna be their highest margin business segment, so it's gonna help AMD quite a bit. And then I extrapolated, and I think that in Q3 it's gonna be another all-time high, in Q4 it's gonna be another all-time high, and in Q4 next year gonna be another all-time high. So this kinda is quite similar to Nvidia's last year, Nvidia, where they started 12 months ahead of AMD. And how do I get at these numbers, especially for the data center? So let's have a look at this. We can see that TSMC is kind of the manufacturer for the chips for Nvidia and AMD, especially on the packaging side for these big AI chips. Remember, these are not your small gaming GPUs or CPUs, maybe 100, 200, at best 300-400 square millimeters in die area, the silicon area that they manufacture. These chips from AMD and Nvidia H100 or MI300 are really big. The die size of H100 is 815 square millimeters. The die size of MI300 is 8 times 115 square millimeters. So it's around 900 and something square millimeters. And then since MI300 is not a single big die, it's multiple dies, there's a lot of other stuff as well on the package. So I think the total package size is well above 1,000 square millimeters. And that kind of, design difference between Nvidia's, one big die compared to compared to AMD's, let's say, root of, having many smaller dies and essentially, in a non-technical term, gluing them together. They make 8 smaller dies and connect them to each other via different processes. And that's gonna affect, the amount of number of chips that they're gonna be able to produce per single wafer that they have been allowed at TSMC. And before we looked at the mathematics, so let's have a look at this. These are estimations. It's from the outside very difficult to know the TSMC's capacity for advanced packaging, which these chips for AI are in need for. You can see that by 2023 summer it was rumored to be around 8,000 wafers per month. So that's the essential capacity that Taiwan Semiconductor had to package these different chips. By end of 2023, it was around 11,000. And again, these are really, really rough estimations. It could be, in this 11,000 could be 13 or it could be 9. But it's, I think, in the kind of rough ballpark, But we can say that, it's not going to be 500 or 100,000. It's somewhere around, 8 to 15,000 thereabouts. But I went with 11. Doing some research and looking at, Dylan Patel, which is an industry insider. I looked at SemiWiki, Daniel Nelly's webpage, very important with a lot of people with high knowledge. I looked at Ian Cottress. So yeah, it's a lot of, sources that I decided to combine and arrive at this number. Then you can see that by summer of this year, I'm going with 20,000 wafers totally per month for TSMC. And by end of this year, 32,000. Now, there are obviously, some sources that they are speaking about even higher than this number here, 50,000, 40,000. But I went with this number. You can see that Nvidia's wafer allocation by early summer last year was much higher than AMD. They anticipated the demand for AI, as we can see also, on the results of the company now, much, much better. And they were much more prepared for this, the same way that Nvidia was for the Bitcoin kind of bull market a couple of years ago. you can see that by end of last year, NVIDIA was already in volume production. AMD just started to kind of ramp up. And these are again estimates. You know, a lot of sources agree that NVIDIA has roughly half of the entire TSMC CoWoS advanced packaging. So that's why, you know, I went just below, let's say, half of the capacity for the past two periods, you know, the 2024 end of the year, 2024 summer, and then end of the year last year. And you can see that, you know, AMD, it's a fairly nice ramp up for them, you know, going from 50 wafers to 800, maybe 1,000 wafers by end of the year on a monthly run rate. But, you know, it's nothing compared to NVIDIA, but for AMD, you know, a company that is even, I think, 1/10 or maybe 1/15 the market cap of NVIDIA, you know, they don't need to compete with NVIDIA on terms of volume, you know. If AMD gets 10% of the market by revenue size, oh, the stock price is gonna probably react very well. So let's look at the more in detail in the mathematics. So you can see that I calculated that AMD by end of last year or the summer of last year should have roughly a production capacity around 3,000 to 3,500 MI300s. This is something that has been, you know, increased to 10,000 by end of last year on a monthly basis. And then 41,000 around, or let's say 40,000 by this summer, and then maybe 55,000 by end of this year. And how do I arrive at this number? Well, I use the silicon calculator, as you can see here. So this is, you know, the width of each of those 8 small MI300 chiplets. You know, remember that AMD's chip is not like NVIDIA's one single big die. So it's 8 smaller ones. And they're around, let's say, 100 square millimeters each, 110 square millimeters each. And I went with, you know, let's say a square die, so 10.7 millimeters on each direction. And then, you know, some just calculations and napkin math. I went with a yield of, let's say, with the defect density of 0.05. And this number, I kind of got it from Daniel Nenny's forum. He's an industry insider, semi-wiki owner, I think, and it's a lot of professional videos within this market. And this post is from back in 2020, where the 5 nanometer process was kind of ramping up. And why 5 nanometer? Because AMD's MI300 is based on the TSMC 5nm. And back then they were going for defect density around 0.1. But they already, you know, back then in 2020 mentioned that within a year, so essentially in second half of 2021, it should be around 0.06. So now 3 years later, I think that, you know, we can safely say that, you know, at least it should be around 0.6, but I went with slightly better 0.5. And, you know, this gives me a yield of 95% with, let's say, good dice per wafer, which would be 553 good dice per a single wafer. So going back to the calculator, you know, this means that, you know, we have 553 of these 8 small 115 square millimeter chips. So if you take them, you know, 553 divided by 8, which is the number of, you know, MI300s that you technically could manufacture per single wafer. And you know, this is how I arrived. You know, I took the number of 69 times the number of wafer allocated at each time period. This is how I get this number. But I think, you know, maybe that's a bit too optimistic. So I, you know, went a bit more conservative. So how do I arrive at this 55 number? Well, I took, you know, 69 times 0.8, which means that I'm going with essentially 20%, 25% less yield, you know, in the packaging stage. You know, that kind of, this kind of, you know, yield that you get here is on the chip manufacturing each die. But then you have to go through the, you know, the advanced packaging, you know, this CoWoS packaging. And there's a lot of steps done in that stage as well that will result in some of the chips being defect. So that's why I went with 55, and going with that number instead of 69, we'll obviously get a bit less of, you know, MI300s per wafer. But this is the numbers I get then. And yeah, so 2,700 instead of 3,500, and, you know, by summer of this year, instead of 41,000, 42,000, around 35,000. So it's a small impact, but, you know, it's still quite a bit for AMD. And how realistic are these numbers? Well, again, it's difficult to say, everything is based on assumptions. This was an assumption. The manufacturing capacity of advanced packaging at TSMC. This one is an assumption, how many of these wafers are allocated to each company. And then, the defect density and all that kind of stuff, although I'm quite confident that it's in the same rough ballpark, but again, that's also an assumption, but we have to start somewhere. And if anyone is, understanding this better, please comment in the comment section. But you can see that the next step, so you see this is the rough revenue numbers that I came up with. So by summer of last year, you should expect around 40 million in revenue for AMD per single month, so on a monthly basis, which would be increasing to around 120 million by end of the year in 2023, and then increasing to 500 million monthly run rate. Now these numbers will start to get interesting, because 500 million monthly run rate would give you around 6 billion on a yearly run rate, which is, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the stock kind of took a, let's say, a nosedive, since the March peak, which was $227, which coincided with the, the discussions about that AMD's MI300 sales for the year would be around 4 billion. That's what Lisa Su said by the Q1 earnings report. So that was a bit, negative in terms of expectations from the market, which a lot of the market was expecting around 6 to 8 billion. But, my numbers, again, by end of this year, by summer, it's going to be 500 monthly sales in millions. And then, by end of the year, maybe 650 million US dollar per month in terms of MI300 sales. Now, obviously, that was my own rough estimation going from, the wafers, and, if you follow from these sources that, say the allocations of how much AMD should be able to get from Taiwan Semiconductor. One other way to look at it is to actually look at, the expected revenue. So, you remember this one that I expected that the data center would be around, increasing from 2.3 billion to, let's say, 400 more millions, and then, another 800 and so on, another 1 billion for each single quarter from now on. And this number is just not a guess, because if you remember on the earnings report in Q1, Lisa Su said that they managed to sell over 1 billion in sales for Q1 this year, so January, February, March, and Q3 last year. And we know that Q4 last year. And last year, they were essentially, counting, I would say, December, because it was a late ramp. So you could say that for those 4 months, AMD managed to sell 1 billion. Now, if we give them the benefit of the doubt that 400 million of that rough 1 billion went for Q4 last year, and then the, let's say, remaining 600 million of the 1 billion went for Q1. So my assumption is that 600 million of this 2.3 in the data center revenue for AMD is from MI300. And I assume that, that's going to be increased to around 1 billion, or let's say 800 million already by Q2, which is going to be reported in couple of weeks, maybe in 4 or 5 weeks from now. And this is how I arrive at those kind of numbers. So I went, with Q1, 650 million, as I explained, 800 million for Q2. And here I assumed a average selling price of $15,000, the same as I did, in this also calculations here. This is how I arrived at the, the revenue. So I took, the number of units of MI300 times the price, $15,000. Yeah, so where were we? We were at, the 800 million Q2. Then another, 700 million in ramp for Q3, and then another, 2 billion, 2.4. Now, you remember that Lisa Su said that, they started in the Q4 last year to say that they're expecting more than 1 billion in MI300 sales. They increased that to, I think, 1.5 billion or 2 billion in just early this year, and then at the earnings report they increased that number again to 4 billion for the entire of 2024. But my estimations ends up being a bit higher, $5.5 billion US dollar. which I think, in my opinion, I think Lisa Su is usually a bit conservative. So, and I think they're gonna beat that. And she didn't necessarily say, that all their AI GPUs will be 4 billion. She said MI300 sales, which technically gives the opening that, the new chips that AMD announced a couple of weeks ago, the likes of, MI325X, which will be launched by Q4 this year. That's not included in that 4 billion. And also, the older version, MI250X. So I think, she was a bit conservative. Maybe they played, a bit of kind of foul play on the market and trying to not be over optimistic and as usual be a bit conservative. So that's how I arrive at, the 5.4 billion US dollar, because I think they will be able to beat that. But then again, maybe both of my estimations are a bit, wrong. So I went with the Dr. Ian Cutres. He's active on Twitter, and he's someone that I've been following for many years. I think he's a very good guy with a very well technical understanding on AMD and Intel and the entire semiconductor space. And he kind of increased his own estimations from 100,000 MI300s, which he expected for the entire year, to 175,000. And that's based on the overall increase of AMD in January of this year, because they increased their expectations at Q4 earnings report that they were gonna increase their sales from 2 billion to 3.5. So based on that, he kind of increased his own estimations from 100,000 to 175,000. So Ian essentially thinks that each 50,000 MI300s brings in around 1 billion in sales. And that's quite interesting, because that works out to, average selling price of 20,000 US dollar. Now, let's say that Ian just went with those 4 billion, but even he probably would say that there's a room for optimism that, AMD will beat that. So let's say if he also arrives at the same number as I arrived, but with his average selling price, which is, 30% higher than mine, we would be around 270,000 MI300s. But I do believe, but following the market, that, this number of 20,000 is high. In some cases, some people say that AMD kind of gives away the MI300 at much lower price, than that, maybe 10, 12,000, just to gain, the market share in terms of units out there. Maybe not in terms of revenue, but, the more of MI300s are out there, the more of the software are going to be developed for MI300. So I think that's a smart way to go about it. So yeah, looking at all these, numbers, I think that the 300,000, 350,000 to 250,000 MI300s, I think that's roughly where we will end up for AMD in this year. And that should, that's roughly, if 350,000, okay, maybe my summer estimations is a bit higher. The run rate is, at 40,000, it's, that would be 480,000, but my conservative, estimations here is 33,000. So times 12, that would be 360,000 or thereabouts. So, maybe these calculations are fairly right. The number of wafers and all, the yield and, the conservative one, I think is fairly similar. So I think, yeah, this is kind of, for me, still very interesting, because I began the video by saying that I think AMD will be a very good option right now, especially since the stock price has taken a beating. Why do I say that? Because I do think that AMD is ramping up the MI325X, so the successor to the MI300, and this one is probably gonna be more expensive a bit, because it really has advantage in the memory capacity compared to everything else on the market. So that one is gonna definitely, increase the average selling price, and you would expect that AMD now is more prepared than they were Q4 last year. So what do I mean by that? I mean that AMD probably is going to be able to ramp up the MI325X much faster than they did with MI300. And my own, calculations say that MI300 was, selling on a monthly run rate of, let's say, 125 million by end of last year. What if MI325X sells at, let's say twice that rate, 250, 300 million already by the first quarter of, sell? That would mean, that this 600 million, I think, is very possible, maybe 800 million. And this is why I do think that in next year, AMD will be able to sell at the bare minimum $8 billion of MI300, 325Xs. And that's very important because, you know, compared to NVIDIA, who sells right now, let's say, what is it? I think, you know, 40 to 19 billion already in Q1 this year. So, you know, just 19 billion in H100s. But NVIDIA is in their own league. But for AMD, enable to be selling, you know, 8-9 billion of MI300s already next year at the bare minimum, I do think that's conservative. Yeah, I think that's gonna really affect the market. Because imagine, look at this again, you know, their quarterly earnings right now per let's say data center is around 2.3 billion. What happens if you add to that, you know, another almost 3 billion per quarter? You know, it's gonna be the biggest jump in their data center, and it's gonna be huge because, you know, if you look at these numbers again, so my expectation is, you know, by let's say by Q4 of next year, I do think that their data center is gonna be around 6 to 7 billion completely, including their servers, the CPUs. But if you remove the 2 billion that is roughly, let's say, the server CPUs, that gives AMD 4 to 5 billion of, you know, MI300 sales by Q4 next year per single quarter. So yeah, that's gonna come with huge margins, you know, of the basis of 6 billion in data center, AMD will make, you know, maybe 60%, 65% gross margin. That's gonna be maybe, let's say, what is that? You know, let's say 60% gross margin and maybe let's say 40% net profit on that, on the data center. Yeah, that's gonna be at the bare minimum, I think 3.5 billion of net income for data center per quarter. That's like 10 billion of net income for AMD just on the data center segment. Then we don't include all the others, and by that time the embedded will also increase quite a bit. You know, the embedded is in a downturn right now. You know, it's been kind of going from the 1.5 billions to now, you know, 800 million per quarter. But I think that's gonna pick up the sales again by next year. So summarizing this, I do think that, you know, if, in my opinion, AMD will make at the bare minimum $8 billion on the data center in net income next year. And the entire company now is trading at, let's say, $150 and 250 billion market cap. So 250 billion divided by 8 to 10 billion net income, that's a PE ratio of 25. But remember, that's based only on their data center. I haven't mentioned client, gaming, and embedded in this video. If they manage to seek out and eke out maybe 2, 3, 4 billions also from that segment, those are the rest of the segments, yeah, you know, you're getting to a PE ratio of maybe 12 for a company of AMD size. And, you know, with their all the, you know, support and all the technical knowledge that they have, the FPGAs, the CPUs, the GPUs, the iGPUs, the NPUs, yeah. So I think this is a really company to own. And that's why, in my opinion, it's one of the, if not the best opportunity right now, especially considering the kind of stock price going down from 220 to 150. So again, this is not investor advice, but thank you for watching, and like the video, and see you in the next one.